e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, knight c3, d6, d3, bishop e6, bishop b3, bishop takes b3, a, takes b3, a6, bishop e3, bishop takes e3, f takes e3, queen f6, queen e2, knight b4, short castle, queen h6, queen f2, knight f6, queen d2, c5, knight a4, b5, knight c3, short castle, rook a3, knight c6, h3, b4, rook a2, b takes c3, queen takes c3, queen takes e3 check, king h1, knight h5, king h2, knight f4, rook e1, queen f2, queen d2, queen takes d2, knight takes d2, knight b4, rook a4, knight takes c2, rook ea1, knight takes a1, d4, d5, c4, e5, d takes e5, d takes c4, e3, queen takes d1 check, king takes d1, knight c6, knight f3, f6, e takes f6, knight takes f6, bishop takes c4, knight e4, king e2, knight b4, bishop b3, bishop g4, knight d2, knight takes d2, bishop takes d2, bishop takes f3 check, king takes f3, knight c6, rook he1, long castle, bishop c3, bishop b4, bishop takes b4, knight takes b4, rook ed1, rook takes d1, rook takes d1, rook d8, bishop e6 check. e4, e6, c4, c5, knight c3, knight c6, d3, knight f6, knight f3, d5, c takes d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, knight takes d5, queen e2 check, bishop e7, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, g3, bishop g4, bishop g2, knight d4, queen e3, knight c2 check, king f1, knight takes e3 check, king e1, knight takes g2 check, king f1, bishop takes f3, bishop e3, knight takes e3 check, f takes e3, bishop takes h1, king e2, queen f3 check, king d2, queen g2 check, king c3, short castle, rook c1, b5, rook c2, b4 check, king b3, queen d5 check, king a4, queen c6 check, king b3, bishop d5 check, rook c4, bishop takes c4 check, d takes c4, queen f3, a4, queen takes e3 check, king c2, b3 check, king d1, rook a d8 checkmate. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, d6, knight c3, knight f6, d3, b5, bishop b3, knight a5, bishop e3, bishop e7, h3, knight takes b3, a takes b3, bishop b7, short castle, short castle, queen d2, rook e8, knight h2, d5, e takes d5, knight takes d5, knight f3, bishop b4, knight h2, queen d7, rook a e1, queen c6, f4, knight takes c3, queen f2, knight d5, f takes e5, bishop takes e1, queen takes f7 check, king h8, e6, knight takes e3, e4, d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3, queen d8, bishop c4, knight c6, h3, bishop f5, d3, e6, knight f3, bishop c5, bishop g5, f6, bishop f4, e5, bishop e3, bishop takes e3, f takes e3, knight ge7, short castle, queen d7, knight b5, a6, knight c3, bishop e6, bishop takes e6, queen takes e6, d4, long castle, queen e2, e takes d4, e takes d4, queen takes e2, knight takes e2, knight f5, c3, knight e3, rook f2, rook he8, knight f4, g5, knight d3, knight d5, c4, knight b6, b3. Knight takes d4. Knight takes d4. Rook takes d4. Knight c5. Rook d6. Rook a f1. Rook f8. Rook e1. Rook f7. Rook e8 check. Rook d8. Rook fe2. c6. Rook 8 e7. Rook takes e7. Rook takes e7. Knight d7. Knight e6. Rook h8. b4. h5. a4. h4. King f2. Knight e5. Knight c5. b6. Knight takes a6. Knight takes c4. Rook c7 check. King d8. Rook takes c6. Knight b2. Rook takes b6. Rook e8. Rook takes f6. Knight takes a4. Rook f7. Rook e7. Rook f5. Rook g7. b5. King c8. Knight b4. King b7. Rook f6. Rook c7. Knight d5. Rook c5. Rook f7 check. King c8. Knight e7 check. King d8. Knight c6 check. King e8. Rook b7. Knight c3. Knight a7. King d8. b6. Knight d5. Rook b8 check. King d7. b7. King c7. Rook c8 check. King takes b7. Rook takes c5. King takes a7. Rook takes d5. e4. e5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Bishop c4. Bishop c5. d3. h6. Bishop e3. Bishop takes e3. F takes e3. Knight f6. Knight c3. d6. h3. Bishop e6. Bishop b3. Bishop takes b3. A takes b3. Short castle. Short castle. d5. E takes d5. Knight takes d5. e4. Knight takes c3. B takes c3. f5. Queen e2. F takes e4. Queen takes e4. Queen e7. d4. E takes d4. Queen takes e7. Knight takes e7. C takes d4. Rook a d8. Rook a d1. Knight f5. Knight e5. Knight e3. Rook takes f8 check. King takes f8. Rook e1. Knight takes c2. Knight g6 check. King f7. Knight e5 check. King g8. Rook e4. Rook takes d4. Rook takes d4. Knight takes d4. b4. b6. Knight f3. Knight takes f3 check. G takes f3. a5. B takes a5. B takes a5. King f2. a4. King e2. a3. King d2. a2. King c2. a1 promotes to queen. King b3. c5. King c4. Queen c1 check. King d5. Queen d1 check. King takes c5. Queen takes f3. King d6. Queen takes h3. King e7. Queen d3. King e8. g5. King e7. g4. King e8. g3. King e7. g2. King f6. g1 promotes to queen. King e7. Queen e1 check. King f6. Queen f3 check. e4. d6. Knight f3. Knight f6. e5. D takes e5. Knight takes e5. Knight b d7. f4. e6. Bishop c4. Knight takes e5. f takes e5. Knight d7. d4. Queen h4 check. g3. Queen e4 check. King f2. Bishop e7. Knight c3. Queen f5 check. Queen f3. Queen takes c2 check. Bishop e2. Rook b8. Rook b1. b6. Bishop e3. Bishop b7. d5. Knight takes e5. Queen e4. Queen takes e4. Knight takes e4. Bishop takes d5. Knight c3. c5. Rook hd1. Bishop c6. Bishop f4. Bishop f6. Knight b5. Rook b7. Knight d6 check. King e7. Knight takes b7. Bishop takes b7. a4. Knight g6. Bishop d6 check. King e8. Bishop b5 check. King d8. Bishop takes c5 check. King c7. Rook d7 check. King b8. Bishop d6 check. King a8. Rook takes f7. Bishop d4 check. King f1. Bishop d5. Rook c1. Rook d8. Bishop c6 check. Bishop takes c6. Rook takes c6. Bishop takes b2. Rook c2. Bishop e5. Bishop takes e5. Knight takes e5. Rook takes g7. Rook f8 check. King g2. h5. Rook c7. Rook d8. Rook takes a7 check. King b8. Rook gb7 check. King c8. Rook takes b6. Rook d2 check. King f1. Rook takes h2. Rook takes e6. Rook h1 check. King g2. Rook e1. Rook e8 checkmate.